Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. 3 days after Grandpa's burial, my hands still smelling of stale coffee from his kitchen. My phone lit up with a barley sunset. The text read, "Do not wait for us." Finally spending the inheritance. What my brother Brant did not realize was the cash he thought he took was already gone. Worse, he had just tried to steal the exact thing that would destroy his future the moment I opened the files. My name is Vivian Green. I am 36 years old, born and raised in the heavy, humid embrace of the South Carolina low country. Right now, I am standing in the exact center of a silence so profound it feels like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The kitchen of the old lodge smells like stale chory coffee, lemon dish soap, and the faint, ever-present undertone of pluff mud from the swamp outside. I am wearing the same black dress I wore to the cemetery 3 days ago. The fabric is stiff, catching the humid air drifting through the window screens. In my hands, I hold a silver spoon. It is slightly tarnished, the handle worn smooth by decades of my grandfather's grip as he stirred his morning coffee. Then the screen of my phone on the counter lights up. A single chime cuts through the thick quiet of the room. I do not wipe my hands immediately. I let the warm soapy water drip from my fingers onto the faded linoleum floor as I lean over to read the screen. The image loads slowly. It is a photograph of a vivid orange and purple sunset over a pristine beach in Bali. A pair of crystal glasses sit on a woven table in the foreground. Beneath the image is a short string of text from my older brother, Brant. Do not wait for us. Finally spending the inheritance in the movies. This is the moment the sister screams. She throws the phone against the wall, shattering the glass. She drops the antique spoon, letting it clatter into the porcelain sink. She collapses onto the floor, weeping at the cruel audacity of her own flesh and blood. I do none of those things. I do not cry. I do not call him back to demand an explanation. I do not break a single thing in this sacred quiet house. Instead, I place Silas Green's silver spoon gently onto the drying rack. I pick up a towel, dry my hands meticulously, finger by finger. I look at the text message again. I do not see a brother mocking his grieving sister. I see a premature confession. I see a man who has just walked blindly into a vault, grabbed what he thought was gold, and happily locked the heavy steel door from the inside. To understand the sheer magnitude of Brant's delusion, you have to understand what he thinks he just stole. Grandpa Sealers did not leave behind a pristine antebellum mansion dripping with Spanish moss and historical prestige. He left behind Marshlanton Lodge. To the untrained, impatient eye, specifically to Brant and his relentlessly polished wife, Audra Vale, the lodge is a dying dinosaur. It is an old, weather-beaten motor lodge hugging the muddy edge of the salt marsh. It features a sagging wooden dock, a chaotic outdoor repair shop where boat engines sit in various states of disassembly, and a neon sign that buzzes with a desperate, failing electricity. Every night they look at this place and see a burden. They see an unliquidated asset, a pile of rotting wood standing in the way of a quick payout. But I know what Marshlanton Lodge really is. I know that beneath the peeling teal paint and the smell of marine grease, this place sits on exactly 17 acres of prime coastal real estate. 17 acres that border a major commercial shipping route. The county is quietly preparing to expand. More importantly, this is my entire childhood. This is the front desk, where my grandmother used to write out guest receipts with a blunt yellow pencil, the graphite smudging against the cheap paper. This is the dock, where Grandpa Sealers taught me how to tie a bowline knot before I could even ride a bicycle. This is the very porch where he taught me how to look a man in the eye and determine within 60 seconds if he was speaking from his heart or if he just smelled money in the water. Brant and Orber have spent the last 5 years whispering about the lodge as if it were a carcass waiting to be divided. They tolerated the humid family dinners, the scent of engine oil, and the slow, agonizing decline of Silas's health solely for the promise of the deed. To them, the lodge was just a stubborn obstacle. To me, it was a living, breathing promise I swore to keep. Looking at the brightly lit photo of the Barley sunset, a cold, sharp clarity settles over me. Brant sent this message thinking he has orchestrated a brilliant, Ruthless checkmate. He wants me to picture him sitting thousands of miles away, sipping a high-end cocktail invincible and rich, while I am left behind in the dusty, grief-stricken ruins of our grandfather's life, choking on funeral ashes and unpaid bills. He wants to be the winner. He wants me to be the devastated little sister who arrived too late. What Brant does not know is that I was not late. I was exactly 24 hours early. He sent that message believing he had successfully drained the primary operating accounts. He believes the digital wire transfer he initiated in the chaotic aftermath of the burial went completely unnoticed. But while he was busy packing designer resort wear and congratulating himself on his own hollow cleverness, I was sitting at my laptop in the dark. I had already locked down the withdrawal rights. I had already transferred the true operating funds into a newly established impenetrable estate account. And because I know exactly how my brother's mind works, I left a carefully calculated decoy balance in the old account. I left just enough funds sitting there so the banking portal would still appear active, allowing his fraudulent transfer to register, process, and ultimately trap him. I gave him the rope. He gleefully draped it around his shoulders and booked a first-class flight to paradise to celebrate. The juxtaposition is almost poetic. Half a world away, Brant and Audra are bathing in golden hour light, toasting to their stolen wealth, entirely consumed by a greed that makes them feel utterly untouchable. Here, in the quiet dimness of South Carolina, I am surrounded by the heavy scent of funeral, the dust of a long life lived, and the ironclad legalities of Silas Green's final wishes. They think they are standing in the sun. They do not realize they are standing on a trap door. I turn away from the kitchen counter, leaving the phone face up. My footsteps echo softly on the original hardwood floors as I walk down the narrow hallway toward the back office. The air in here is thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and grandpa's pipe tobacco. I step behind the heavy oak desk that dominates the room. I do not sit in his leather chair. Instead, I kneel on the woven rug and pull open the heavy bottom right drawer. It squeaks a familiar, comforting sound. Inside, past the old ledger books and the spare keys to the boat motors, lies a single manila envelope. The paper is crisp, distinctly out of place among the yellow documents surrounding it. I reach out and pick it up. The heavy stock paper feels solid against my fingertips. Across the front, written in grandpa's sealers is unmistakable, sharp, slanted handwriting, is a single sentence. It is not a greeting, nor a traditional farewell. It is an instruction penned by a man who knew exactly what kind of blood ran in his grandson's veins. If Brant is in too much of a hurry, you will know what to do. I run my thumb over the blue ink. The anger that had been simmering deep in my stomach for the past 3 days hardens into something entirely different. It becomes ice. It becomes focus. Brant wanted to play a game of ruthless acquisition while the dirt on our grandfather's grave was still damp. He thought he could steal the board and run. He is about to learn Silas Green, and I wrote the rules of the game long before he even knew we were playing. I do not just understand paper trails. I hunt them for a living. For the past 7 years, I have worked as a senior compliance investigator for Maro Civic Power, a massive regional infrastructure conglomerate. My daily professional existence revolves around unearthing internal fraud, tracking anomalous wire transfers, and dismantling elaborate chains of forged procurement documents. I sit in sterile fluorescent-lit conference rooms and watch high-level executives sweat through their expensive tailored suits when I slide a highlighted undeniable bank statement across a mahogany table. I know exactly what a lie looks like when it is disguised on a spreadsheet. I know how desperate people try to hide their financial bleeding behind dense corporate jargon, aggressive bluster, and forced smiles. Grandpa's sealers knew this about me when he deliberately bypassed the traditional expected hierarchy of our family to leave the heavy lifting of his estate to me. It was not an act of blind grandfatherly favoritism. Sealers Green was a deeply pragmatic man who trusted calluses over compliments. He did not hand me the legal reins because I was the sweet, beautiful granddaughter. He handed them to me because I was the absolute only person in our entire bloodline who actually read the fine print on a binding contract. I was the only one who truly understood the unforgiving, brutal current of cash flow. Most importantly, I possessed the one distinct behavioral trait our family desperately lacked: the sheer, unyielding stubbornness to look a relative right in the eye and say the word no when everyone else just wanted to cave in and keep the peace. Brant is 4 years older than I am, and for his entire life, that 4-year head start was all the leverage he ever needed to dominate the room. He is undeniably handsome, possessing the kind of easy, effortless charm that makes people forgive him before he even finishes apologizing for whatever mess he just made. He is the perpetual golden boy of the family, the man who knows exactly how to disarm a tense, angry situation with a perfectly timed, self-deprecating joke and a flash of a brilliantly white smile. If Brant knocked over your favorite priceless heirloom vase, he would somehow within 5 minutes convince you that the room actually looked significantly better without it. You would probably end up thanking him for his keen eye for modern interior design. But charm is an incredibly expensive emotional currency to maintain, and Brand has been running a massive deficit for a very long time. Then there is his wife, Audra Vale. Audra is a masterclass in aggressive weaponized politeness. She is the type of woman who glides into a crowded room wearing a perfectly tailored neutral-toned linen dress projecting a facade of absolute flawless kindness. Her voice is always remarkably soft-pitched to a soothing, almost hypnotic murmur, and her eyes radiate a carefully manufactured warmth. But if you watch Audra closely, if you strip away the pleasantries and really pay attention to the micro-movements of her focus, you will notice a chilling detail. She always evaluates the inanimate objects in a room before she acknowledges the living human beings occupying it. She assesses the weave of the vintage rugs, tests the weight of the silverware with her fingertips, checks the brand of the kitchen appliances, silently pricing the environment before she decides exactly how much respect to allocate to the host. Over the years, Audra developed a deeply irritating parasitic habit of treating Marshlanton Lodge like her personal free-of-charge antique boutique. She would visit for a casual Sunday family dinner and invariably ask to temporarily borrow things. First, it was a heavy, ornate silver serving tray she claimed she desperately needed for an impromptu brunch party with her socialite friends. Then, it was a rare dual lens vintage film camera Grandpa kept on a dusty bookshelf in the hallway. Later, she set her sights on a couple of the old, beautifully rusted neon signs sitting in the back storage shed, claiming she wanted to use them for an industrial chic photo shoot for a local magazine. She never returned a single item. Once those objects crossed the threshold of her impeccably decorated, spotless home, she suffered from incredibly convenient amnesia, treating the stolen goods as if they had always belonged to her by divine right. I watched it all happen, quietly documenting every single transgression in the silent, expanding ledger of my mind. I never screamed at them across the roasted turkey at Thanksgiving. I never initiated a public dramatic screaming match over the stuffed film cameras or the missing silver tray. Instead, I applied the exact same analytical methodology I use every single day at Mara Civic Power. I observed the raw data. I tracked their lifestyle, and the numbers painted a blaring, unavoidable picture of impending ruin. Several years ago, Brant managed to convince Grandpa Sealers to lend him a massive sum of money to open a high-end exclusive fitness coaching service in the city. Brant sold the vision beautifully, operating at the absolute peak of his charm. He brought glossy, professionally printed brochures, spoke animatedly of elite, wealthy clientele, and promised aggressive financial returns that would make the lodge's revenue look like spare pocket change. Grandpa, perhaps desperately wanting to believe in the potential of his only grandson one last time, cut the heavy check. Brant burned through every single cent of that funding in under 12 months. He rented a premium glassfront commercial space he absolutely could not afford. He purchased state-of-the-art imported fitness equipment outright instead of securing sensible leases. He spent an absolute fortune on aggressive, flashy marketing campaigns that yielded exactly zero long-term client retention. When the business inevitably imploded, leaving behind a massive smoking crater of broken commercial leases and furious unpaid vendors, Brant did not display a single ounce of genuine remorse. He sat out on the wooden porch of the lodge, casually sipping an expensive craft beer, and smoothly referred to the catastrophic loss of Grandpa's life savings as a necessary business lesson. He waved off the monumental failure as if he had just accidentally misplaced a $20 bill, completely insulated from the crushing financial gravity of his own spectacular incompetence. While Brandt and Order continued to project an immaculate image of affluent success to the outside world, I saw the rapidly fraying edges of their reality because I know exactly where to look. I saw the late credit card payments quietly accumulating punishing interest rates. I noticed the high-interest personal loans being rolled over, desperately restructured to buy them just 2 or 3 more months of breathing room. I saw the commercial property lease for the failed gym get terminated early for severe non-payment. They continued to host lavish, heavily catered dinner parties to maintain their fragile social standing. But I happened to know the local caterer they used, and I knew those elaborate, expensive invoices were always paid 30 to 60 days late, usually only after a barrage of frantic, pleading phone calls from the vendor. They were a hollow, rotting shell of wealth, a precarious financial house of cards standing in a stiff coastal breeze, and the only thing keeping them from total public collapse was the deeply misguided, desperate belief that the very moment Grandpa Sealers died, the immediate sale of the 17 acres beneath Marsh Lanton Lodge would magically wipe their slate clean and fund their delusions for another decade. Grandpa Sealers saw it too. His physical body may have been slowly failing him after the stroke, but his mind remained as sharp and unforgiving as the edge of a newly honed hunting knife. He knew exactly what Brandt was waiting for in the dark. I vividly remember the humid afternoon he called me into his study to discuss the final permanent amendments to his will. The old window air conditioner was humming loudly, fighting a losing battle against the oppressive thick July heat. He sat in his worn leather chair, looking physically smaller and frailer than I remembered, but his dark eyes were bright and utterly resolute. He pushed a thick, heavy stack of legally binding trust documents across the scarred wooden desk toward me. He did not offer a long, emotional speech about maintaining our family legacy or honoring the sacred bonds of blood. He knew we were far beyond that kind of useless sentimentality. He just tapped his gnarled, arthritis-swollen index finger firmly against the primary signature line of the trust document. He looked right at me, his voice carrying the rough, undeniable weight of a final verdict. "I do not need someone who loves this place with words," Grandpa Sealers said, coughing weakly into a handkerchief before straightening his posture. "Words are cheap. Vivian Bratt has 1,000,000 of them, and they are all utterly worthless. I need someone who will not sell it when they are scared." That was the mandate. That was the true inheritance. It was not just a piece of commercial property. It was a loaded weapon, and Grandpa Sealers had placed it firmly and deliberately in my hands because he knew without a shadow of a doubt that I would not hesitate to pull the trigger if the wolves ever came knocking at the door. The decline of Silas Green was not a sudden plunge, but a grueling Inchbean surrender to his own failing biology. After the mild stroke hit him in late autumn, the vibrant, booming patriarch who used to haul heavy boat engines out of the marsh water was reduced to a fragile silhouette sitting by the window. For the final 6 months of his life, he resided almost entirely in the converted first-floor bedroom of the lodge. His mind, however, stubbornly refused to dim. It remained a steel trap, processing information with the same ruthless efficiency he had possessed in his prime. But the sheer physical toll of managing the sprawling, complicated ecosystem of Marsh Lanton Lodge had simply become too much. He could no longer spend hours hunched over his desk, auditing the county tax assessments or cross-referencing the shifting environmental compliance codes for the waterfront. In the brutal calculus of family inheritance, weakness acts as a beacon. The moment Grandpa's frailty became undeniable, Brandt's behavior underwent a radical, chilling transformation. Historically, maintaining consistent communication with my brother required immense effort. Getting him to answer a basic question about holiday scheduling usually took 3 business days and multiple follow-up texts. Suddenly, he was the model of attentive devotion. His phone calls arrived with alarming regularity, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. He always led with his signature, effortless charm, asking about Grandpa's blood pressure or his appetite, but the pivot was always swift and entirely transactional. He would smoothly transition from discussing physical therapy to casually asking how the lodge's primary operating accounts were handling the influx of medical bills. A few days later, he would call under the pretense of sharing a nostalgic memory about the old docks, only to casually inquire about who possessed the physical security token required to authorize major outgoing wire transfers. By the fourth month of Grandpa's decline, Brant's inquiries stopped pretending to be polite. He actively requested updated topographic maps of the 17 acres of undeveloped land directly behind the main property. He even had the audacity to ask, framing it as a helpful technological update, if Grandpa was still utilizing his outdated legacy email address to execute legally binding electronic signatures. As a senior compliance investigator, I spend my life dissecting the anatomy of financial deception. I did not give Brant the satisfaction of a confrontation. I answered every single one of his probing questions with the most aggressively boring, legally ambiguous corporate speak I could muster, but internally my alarms were screaming. This was the reconnaissance phase. Audra, proving herself to be the far more sophisticated half of their parasitic partnership, deployed a completely different tactical maneuver. She abandoned her usual haughty detachment and fully embraced the role of the devoted, weeping daughter-in-law. She began making the 2-hour drive from the city multiple times a month, always arriving with heavy glass containers filled with expensive organic soups she claimed took hours to simmer. She brought thick artisanal sympathy cards filled with poetic, looping cursive about the enduring strength of family bonds. She would pull a heavy wooden chair right up to the edge of Grandpa's bed and sit in suffocating silence for 3 or 4 hours, insisting she simply could not bear the thought of him feeling isolated. But I was always watching from the dimly lit hallway. While her voice murmured soft, meaningless comforts, her eyes were razor-sharp, darting around the room with intense, calculated hunger. She rarely looked at the dying man. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the heavy, fire-resistant green filing cabinet tucked into the far corner of the study. I watched her silently memorize the manufacturer of the brass padlock. I watched her track exactly which drawer Grandpa reached into when he needed his checkbook. I saw her carefully note the exact location of his master ring of keys on the cluttered nightstand. This was not grief. This was asset due diligence. They were systematically mapping the vulnerabilities of the estate before launching their final strike. It gave me the distinct, terrifying feeling of a disaster approaching, not with a loud warning siren, but in soft, silent velvet shoes. Grandpa sealers, even through the haze of pain medication, perceived every single microscopic detail of their treachery. He did not waste his final reserves of energy screaming at them. He did not demand tears or apologies, because he knew any remorse they offered would be entirely counterfeit. Instead, he waited until Audra packed up her empty soup containers and drove her pristine luxury vehicle back to the city. Then he looked at me, his breathing shallow but his eyes completely lucid, and told me to summon Layer Boone. Layer was a terrifyingly competent estate attorney. She wore impeccably tailored, severe suits and spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. When she arrived at the lodge, we bypassed the comfortable living room entirely. The three of us convened around the scarred wooden kitchen table, forming a tight, impenetrable war council. Under Layer's aggressive legal orchestration, Grandpa systematically dismantled the existing ownership structure of his entire life's work. We executed a complex series of transfers, folding the physical land, the lodge buildings, and the commercial docking rights into a newly minted corporate entity named Green Title Holdings Limited Liability Company. The operating agreement was a masterpiece of defensive legal engineering. It explicitly, undeniably dictated that upon the exact moment of Silas Green's death, every single ounce of executive control, signatory authority, and operational power bypassed the standard probate process and transferred directly, exclusively to me. But that restructuring was merely the outer defensive wall. The true payload, the secret that made the property worth fighting for, was the deal Grandpa had been quietly cultivating in the shadows. Those 17 acres of overgrown mosquito-infested land behind the lodge were not a worthless swamp. A massive, fiercely private global logistics conglomerate known as Blue Meridian Freight had identified our specific muddy water frontage as the absolute critical choke point required for their upcoming eastern seaboard expansion. They wanted to execute a 99-year commercial ground lease. The financial compensation attached to their preliminary term sheet was almost difficult to comprehend. We were looking at millions of dollars in guaranteed generation-altering revenue structured to pay out in heavy, unyielding quarterly dividends for the rest of my natural life. However, Blue Meridian Freight was a corporate leviathan that abhorred public legal friction. Their absolute non-negotiable condition for closing the deal was a completely pristine, unencumbered chain of title. Lair leaned across the kitchen table, her voice dropping to a serious whisper as she outlined the critical vulnerability. The second grandpa passed away, the estate would technically enter the probate transition period. During that highly chaotic, vulnerable window of time, if anyone managed to file a fraudulent mortgage, a mechanic's lien, or a fabricated memorandum of option against the property with the county clerk, the entire ecosystem would instantly freeze. It would not matter if the document was a blatant, provable forgery. The mere existence of a legal cloud hovering over the title would cause the risk-averse executives at Blue Meridian Freight to terminate the negotiations and walk away forever. Brandt was completely ignorant of the logistics deal. He only knew the land had intrinsic value. If he decided to throw a legal wrench into the gears just to extract a quick coercive cash settlement from the family, he would accidentally annihilate the greatest financial victory Grandpa had ever secured. To neutralize this threat, Grandpa signed a deeply classified contingency plan. It was a scorched earth legal directive, a poison pill designed to instantly and permanently disinherit any beneficiary who attempted to encumber, leverage, or sell the property during the fragile transition period. We locked the heavily notarized documents deep inside Lair's secure vault, told absolutely no one, and waited for the inevitable betrayal. The dam broke exactly 2 weeks before Grandpa drew his final breath. It was a Tuesday evening. The coastal air was thick, suffocatingly humid, and carried the sharp metallic scent of an approaching thunderstorm. I had stepped out through the back kitchen door to take the heavy bags of recycling to the bins. As I rounded the corner of the wraparound porch, the sound of crunching gravel stopped me dead in my tracks. Brandt was standing near the edge of the rotting wooden railing, half swallowed by the creeping long shadows of the Spanish moss swaying above him. He was completely alone, gripping his smartphone tightly against his ear. He had entirely dropped his booming, charismatic persona. He was speaking in a rushed, frantic whisper, his free hand raking nervously through his carefully styled hair as he paced back and forth across the damp wood. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold, damp siding of the lodge, and listened intently to the darkness. His voice carried just enough over the sound of the rising, turbulent wind. "I do not care what the expedited filing fee costs." Brandt hissed into the receiver, his tone dripping with a toxic, desperate mixture of panic and raw greed. "Just need the paperwork out before the other side closes. The rest runs itself." He aggressively ended the call, shoving the phone deep into his jacket pocket, and took a long, shaky breath before forcing his posture back into its usual arrogant slouch. I stayed perfectly still, hidden in the deep shadows. Long after he walked back inside the lodge, the storm finally broke overhead, heavy rain violently lashing against the tin roof. I did not feel an ounce of fear or sadness. I felt the cold, terrifying, absolute calm of a hunter who finally sees the whites of the predator's eyes. Brand was actively mobilizing his forged paperwork. He genuinely believed he was running a brilliant race against the ticking clock of a dying man. He had absolutely no idea he was actually sprinting headfirst into a meticulously crafted legal guillotine. The performance began before the coroner even finalized the preliminary paperwork. When the day of the memorial service arrived, the heavy, suffocating humidity of the South Carolina coast hung over the lodge like a wet woolen blanket. Through it all, my brother and his wife executed a flawless, agonizingly perfect pantomime of unimaginable grief. Brandt stood by the heavy oak double doors of the local chapel, shaking hands with every single weathered fisherman, local vendor, and distant cousin who walked through the threshold. He possessed the uncanny ability to produce a single dignified tear, perfectly timed to the climax of his own eulogy. He spoke beautifully about legacy, about the calluses on our grandfather's hands, and about the irreplaceable void left in our family. Order was a masterclass in supportive sorrow. She wore a tailored, understated black dress, her makeup intentionally minimal, her hair pulled back to expose a face etched with a carefully manufactured quiet devastation. She spent the entire morning physically arranging the cold metal folding chairs in the reception hall, repeatedly refusing offers of help with a brave, trembling smile, ensuring every single attendee witnessed her grueling, selfless labor. It was a brilliant show, but I was not watching the tears. I was watching the underlying mechanics. Within the first 48 hours after the heart monitor flatlined, the masks began to slip in incredibly calculated microscopic increments. The family gathered back at the main house of the lodge, the air thick with the scent of white lees and catered fried chicken. Over the clinking of ice and bourbon glasses, Brant managed to corner me in the hallway 3 separate times. He never raised his voice. He kept his tone incredibly gentle, almost soothing, adopting the persona of a fiercely protective older sibling. His message, however, was a relentless, rhythmic hammering against the foundations of the estate. He kept repeating with slight variations that we needed to ensure absolutely everything was divided equally. He insisted it was the only honorable way to respect the dead. He pushed this aggressive narrative of a 5,050 split despite the glaring legal reality that the official reading of the final will had not even been scheduled yet. Then came the first actual trap. We were standing in the dim light of the kitchen, the low hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. Brant took a slow sip of his drink, looked down at his polished leather shoes, and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. He suggested casually that we should completely delay filing the initial probate documents with the county court. He framed it as an act of familial mercy. He argued that the legal bureaucracy was far too brutal to face immediately. He wanted to give the entire family at least a month to simply breathe, to process the profound emotional trauma before we invited the government to dissect our lives. To the untrained ear, it sounded like the plea of a grieving, overwhelmed grandson. To a seasoned compliance investigator, it sounded exactly like a burglar standing on your front porch, politely asking you to please leave your deadbolt unlocked for a few more nights so you do not strain your wrist turning the key. He needed the official legal record to remain completely blank. He needed that administrative blind spot to file his forged documents without triggering an immediate automated alert from the county clerk's office. While Brant ran the psychological interference, Orbra executed the physical reconnaissance. She had appointed herself the chief custodian of the grieving household, gliding from room to room with a damp cloth and a bottle of surface cleaner, insisting she simply needed a mundane task to keep her mind occupied. I sat quietly in the corner of the dining room, pretending to read a stack of condolence cards and tracked her reflections in the glass panes of the antique china cabinet. She was not cleaning, she was cataloging. When she slipped into the back administrative office, I saw her pull her smartphone from her pocket. She did not take sweeping sentimental photos of the room. She zoomed in. I watched her photograph, the heavy brass combination dial of the floor safe hidden beneath the window. She snapped close-up, high-resolution images of the specific cylinder lock securing the green filing cabinet. She captured the laminated whiteboard detailing the precise shift rotations of the marina staff, carefully noting exactly when the property would be understaffed. The most chilling detail was watching her crouch down and photograph the faded foil emergency contact sticker issued by our local community bank, which was adhered to the underside of the main desk drawer. She was gathering the raw data points required to bypass security protocols. By the second evening, Brant shifted his strategy from delaying the legal process to actively probing the financial plumbing. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, angrily rubbing his temples, launching into a loud, theatrical complaint about the inhumane nature of modern banking. He cursed the institutions that immediately freeze the assets of the deceased, leaving grieving families unable to pay for basic funeral expenses. It was a brilliantly disguised interrogation. Wrapped inside his angry venting were incredibly specific, highly technical questions. He casually wondered aloud about the exact minute-by-minute daily cutoff times for initiating outgoing commercial wire transfers. He pondered the specific legal duration of temporary signatory authorizations when the primary account holder was deceased, but the business entity remained active. He was crowdsourcing his own bank fraud, trying to verify his timeline against my institutional knowledge. I gave him absolutely nothing, feeding him vague, generic platitudes about how complicated corporate compliance can be, watching the hidden frustration tighten the muscles in his jaw. The climax of their covert operation occurred the following afternoon beneath the merciless, beating sun of the cemetery. The heavy bronze casket was suspended over the dark, freshly dug earth. The local pastor was delivering the final solemn commendation. The crowd was a sea of black umbrellas and bowed heads. I stood in the front row, the crushing reality of the loss finally threatening to break through my professional detachment. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Brandt aggressively pat the pockets of his suit jacket. He let out a loud theatrical whisper, apologizing to the weeping aunt beside him, claiming he had a catastrophic multi-million-dollar client crisis that absolutely demanded his immediate attention. He turned his back on the open grave and walked briskly away, his expensive shoes crunching loudly on the gravel path as he headed toward their rental vehicle. Less than a minute later, order vanished. She did not make an excuse. She simply dissolved into the dense crowd of mourners moving toward the parking lot. I kept my eyes fixed on the casket, but I started counting the seconds in my head. I tracked her absence with the cold precision of a stopwatch. She was gone for exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes is not a bathroom break. 17 minutes is not a moment of quiet reflection in the shade of a weeping willow. 17 minutes is the exact amount of time required to sit in the passenger seat of a soundproofed luxury SUV, pull out a laptop, connect to a mobile hotspot, and execute a coordinated series of digital commands utilizing stolen account information while the only person capable of stopping you is standing over a grave. When the final handful of dirt was thrown and the last mourner offered their condolences, I drove back to the empty, silent lodge. The sun had set, plunging the property into deep, suffocating darkness. I did not pour a drink. I did not collapse onto the sofa and finally allow myself to weep. Instead, I walked straight into the back office, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and opened my laptop. I did not bother with the automated customer service lines. I directly dialed the personal cellular number of the regional treasury manager at the community bank, a woman I had professionally collaborated with on multiple fraud investigations over the years, operating entirely within the ironclad, predetermined legal authority granted to me by the secret corporate restructuring. I executed a total financial evacuation. I systematically severed the primary operating accounts from their legacy routing numbers. I transferred the massive accumulated cash reserves of the estate into the newly established, completely insulated trust account. I immediately reset every single digital access token, invalidating any login credentials Brandt might have harvested. But I knew a completely frozen account would trigger an immediate panic, forcing Brandt to pivot and potentially cause unpredictable chaos. So I built a mirage. I deliberately left exactly $2,000 sitting in the old compromised operating account. It was a mathematically perfect decoy balance. It was just enough money to allow the bank's automated portal to show an active positive status, allowing a pending transaction to register in the system without instantly bouncing back an aggressive insufficient funds error. It was enough to make a thief believe the vault was still wide open. The next morning, the heavy silence of the lodge was broken only by the distant calls of the marsh birds. I walked into the kitchen and saw the coffee pot was completely cold. The rental vehicle was gone from the gravel driveway. Brandt and Orber had quietly packed their designer luggage before dawn and raced to the international terminal. They were currently sitting in first-class seats on a flight bound for the other side of the planet. They were soaring through the clouds, drinking champagne, absolutely convinced that their 17-minute operation in the cemetery parking lot had secured their financial salvation before the ashes on the altar had even begun to cool. 3 days after the heavy bronze casket was lowered into the coastal soil, the first invisible trip wire finally snapped. I was sitting at the kitchen island of the lodge, the morning air already thick and humid with my work laptop open. An automated email notification cut through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It was an urgent security alert triggered by the decoy operating account I had deliberately left exposed. Someone had initiated a massive outgoing wire transfer. I clicked the notification, my eyes tracking the digital routing information with the cold practice efficiency of a seasoned investigator. The destination account belonged to a corporate entity registered under the name Pacific Ember Consulting. It sounded like a legitimate sterile financial advisory firm, but I spent 40 hours a week dismantling corporate veils for Mara Civic Power. It took me exactly 4 minutes of cross-referencing state tax registries to expose the truth. Pacific Ember Consulting was not a financial firm at all. It was a boutique high-end travel agency registered to a woman who just happened to be Orber's former college roommate. Brandt and Order were attempting to directly drain the lodge's operating funds to pay for their luxurious Bali escape, routing the stolen inheritance through a friend's business to wash the transaction. That was the first strike. But before I could even take a screenshot of the pending wire authorization, my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. The caller ID displayed the name Noor Cade. Noor was a veteran title officer at the county clerk's office. She had traded summer tomatoes and harsh local gossip with Grand Park sealers for over 2 decades. When I answered, she did not offer a gentle greeting or polite condolences. Her voice was tight, clipped, and radiating absolute professional panic. She informed me the highly suspicious document had just been electronically slipped into the county recording queue, flagged against the specific parcel of land sitting beneath Marsh Lanton Lodge. It was a memorandum of auction. According to the digital filing, this document formerly granted a ruthless private finance firm known as Sunbar Capital Recovery the exclusive, prioritized right to purchase or place a legal hold on the entire property. My blood ran completely cold. The travel agency wire transfer was a petty theft, a frantic grab for spending money, but this county filing was an existential threat. If that memorandum of auctions survived on the public land records for even a few days, it would act as a massive flashing hazard sign to the corporate risk assessment team at Blue Meridian Freight. The logistics Leviathan demanded a completely pristine, unencumbered chain of title before they would ever sign the 19-year commercial lease. The mere existence of a sudden disputed option from a predatory private capital firm would kill the multi-million-dollar agreement instantly. The true generational wealth of the estate would simply evaporate before the rest of the family even realized it existed. I did not panic. I mobilized. I immediately dialed Lilaboom. Within 30 minutes, the two of us launched a synchronized aggressive 3-pronged legal offensive from the back office of the lodge. First, Layer drafted and filed an emergency injunction to formally freeze the title, throwing a massive, impenetrable legal block against the Sunbar filing to prevent it from officially attaching to the deed. Second, I leveraged my corporate compliance credentials and aggressively contacted the bank's internal fraud department, demanding the immediate preservation of the raw, unedited server access logs for the compromised operating account. Third, we submitted an expedited legally binding request to the County Information Technology Department demanding the backend metadata for the electronic filing of the fraudulent memorandum. When you know exactly where to strike the system started producing hard evidence. By the afternoon, the digital forensics began to roll in, and the evidence was remarkably sloppy. The first piece of the puzzle we isolated was the memorandum itself. Layer pulled the digitized scan of the document from the county server. It bore a signature desperately attempting to mimic the jagged, sharp cursive of grandpa sealers. But the fatal flaw was the notary stamp. The official raised seal meant to legally verify his physical presence and willing signature belonged to a commercial shipping and printing store located over 2 hours north of the lodge. On the specific date stamped in blue ink on that document, Grandpa Sealers was actively receiving continuous intravenous fluids in his hospice bed, completely incapable of walking across his own bedroom, let alone driving 2 hours up the interstate to notarize a corporate land deal. The second piece of evidence was a glaring, undeniable digital footprint. The bank security team successfully isolated the exact Internet Protocol address used to initially download the primary wire transfer authorization forms. I cross-referenced the geographic ping. The request did not originate from a secure terminal in Bali, and it certainly did not originate from the local network at the lodge. The digital trail traced directly back to the residential broadband network registered to Brandt's upscale leased apartment in Charlotte. He had meticulously laid the digital groundwork from his own living room before he had even packed his tailored black suit for the funeral. But the third piece of evidence was the one that felt like a physical blow to the chest. It did not arrive from a server or a legal database, but from a deeply human source. Mac, a weathered, quiet mechanic who had maintained the boat engines for Grandpa Sealers for 30 years, knocked tentatively on the office door just as the sun began to set. He looked deeply uncomfortable, constantly shifting his weight from boot to boot, twisting a grease-stained rag in his hands. He confessed that during the crowded, chaotic wake at the main house, he had walked past the back office to use the restroom. The heavy oak door had been left slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, Max saw Orbit standing behind the desk. She was not crying. She was not looking for old photographs. She was holding Grandpa's heavy brass key ring up to the harsh overhead light, rapidly using her smartphone to photograph the jagged cuts of the keys. Worse, he watched her flip over the bank's digital security token, zooming in to capture the localized serial and synchronization codes printed on the back plastic casing. Sitting in the dimming light of the office, the entire terrifying architecture of their betrayal crystallized in my mind. I finally understood the full scope of Brandt's arrogance. He did not just want to aggressively demand his fair 50% of the estate. He was executing a highly coordinated dual-layered attack. The wire transfer was the first stab, a frantic effort to rapidly extract liquid cash to fund his failing lifestyle. But the forged paperwork with Sumbar Capital Recovery was the second truly lethal dagger. He was trying to secretly use forged collateral to sink a massive legal hook into the land itself. His strategy was to intentionally encumber the property, trapping the entire estate in a manufactured, suffocating debt crisis before anyone even looked up from wiping their tears at the cemetery. He wanted to artificially force a desperate fire sale of the land, and he intended to be the one holding the match when the entire legacy burned to the ground. I did not dial emergency services. I did not draft a furious text message to my brother demanding an explanation. Nor did I call Orvra to threaten them both with absolute legal ruin. The average person, when violently robbed by their own blood, screams. They seek immediate, loud, and chaotic justice. They want to confront the betrayal head-on. But in my line of work, spending countless hours dismantling corporate embezzlement and fraudulent accounting schemes, you learn one universal truth very quickly. A panicked criminal will immediately destroy the evidence, whereas a confident, arrogant criminal will gladly hand it to you on a silver platter. I chose the far more dangerous, deeply calculated path for Brandt. I chose to let him continue believing he was a mastermind who had just pulled off the perfect family heist. I left the decoy operating account exactly as it was. The $2,000 I had seated there remained completely untouched by me. When Brandt inevitably logged into his banking portal from his luxury oceanfront villa, the system would automatically show him a positive balance. It was a carefully calibrated psychological torture. It was just enough money to convince him the account was still technically open and functioning, but it was drastically, humiliatingly short of the massive sum he actually needed to save his crumbling financial life and pay off his aggressively mounting debts. By starving him of the millions he expected while keeping the door cracked open with mere pennies, I was actively forcing him to make another desperate, sloppy move. A starving man who genuinely thinks he is standing next to a buffet will always reach for the bait, exposing his hand further with every attempt to feed himself. While Brandt was undoubtedly staring at his phone screen in absolute frustration halfway across the world, Layer Boone was executing a surgical strike in the county courthouse. She filed a highly specialized temporary restrictive covenant against the deed of Marsh Lanton Lodge. It legally paralyzed the property, completely blocking any potential sale, transfer of ownership, or new mortgage origination. However, Layer was an absolute ghost in the legal machinery. She filed the complex paperwork utilizing a specific archaic procedural avenue that intentionally bypassed the automated public notification systems. Brandt would not receive a digital ping on his phone or an automated email alert from the county clerk warning him of the block. The trap was set deep beneath the surface of the water, completely invisible from above. He could swim right into it without ever feeling the heavy mesh of the net tightening around him. The digital evidence was incredibly strong, but we desperately needed physical proof to tie the forged memorandum of option to them definitively. Nora Cade, acting entirely off the official books to protect the estate of a man she deeply respected, reached out to a personal contact she had at the strip mall where the fraudulent notary stamp was issued. By late afternoon, she emailed me a compressed video file. I opened it on my laptop, the bright screen illuminating the dark, quiet office of the lodge. It was grainy, low-resolution security footage captured from the camera mounted directly above the shipping store's entrance. The digital timestamp, perfectly aligned with the exact afternoon Grandpa Sealers was slipping into his final, irreversible coma. In the blurry digital frames, a man with the exact, unmistakable, broad-shouldered build of my brother walked through the glass doors. He wore a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face to obscure his features, but his posture, the arrogant, familiar tilt of his shoulders as he walked, was an absolute dead giveaway. Outside the storefront, leaning casually against the passenger side door of their dark sport utility vehicle, was a woman in a pristine tailored linen dress. It was Audra, standing guard in the suffocating heat while her husband committed a felony inside. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, rubbing my exhausted eyes, and opened the social media application on my phone. I needed to see exactly how arrogant they were currently feeling to accurately gauge their state of mind from thousands of miles away. Brandt had just posted a new photograph. It was a close-up, highly filtered shot of his hand resting casually on the steering wheel of an open-air Jeep, the lush, vibrant green jungle of Bali blurring artistically in the background. My heart completely stopped, and then it hammered against my ribs with a cold, furious, and violent rhythm. It was not the expensive Jeep or the luxury vacation that caught my immediate attention. It was the thick gold band gleaming brightly on his right index finger. It was Grandpa Sealers' heavy gold sign ring, the ring that had mysteriously vanished from his bedside table on the very morning of the funeral. Brandt was not just trying to steal our future. He was actively wearing our grandfather's legacy as a cheap, flashy vacation accessory to impress his equally shallow social circle. The absolute staggering disrespect tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat. The anger threatened to completely cloud my professional judgment. So I immediately redirected the fury into action. I had one massive critical vulnerability left to secure before the walls closed in. I kicked up the office phone and dialed the unlisted corporate number for the acquisition team at Blue Meridian Freight. I navigated through 3 separate layers of executive assistants before finally reaching the lead commercial negotiator. I did not lie to him, but I strictly controlled the flow of information. I formally requested that our pending 99-year lease agreement remain under absolute strict non-disclosure while we finalize the standard mundane probate procedures. The negotiator agreed, but his voice instantly hardened into a serious, uncompromising corporate monotone. He made it unequivocally clear that Blue Meridian Freight possessed zero tolerance for internal family friction or messy legal battles. If even a whisper of a legal dispute, a contested title, or a predatory private capital firm reached their internal legal department, they would permanently terminate the negotiations and immediately pursue their secondary location options further down the coast. The stakes in the dimly lit room instantly multiplied, pressing down on my shoulders with immense physical weight. This was no longer just a battle over the liquid cash was trying to desperately drain to pay off his failed gym and his maxed-out credit cards. If I made a single procedural mistake, if Brandt somehow managed to make his fraudulent Sunbar Capital recovery filing stick to the public record for even a week, I would not just lose the operating funds. I would lose the lease entirely. I would lose the absolute only legitimate legal pathway capable of generating the capital required to save Marshlanton Lodge from being swallowed whole by predatory commercial real estate developers. I was walking barefoot on a razor wire, balancing the entire history and the only viable future of our family over a bottomless drop. Every single move from this point forward had to be completely flawless. I placed my phone face down on the heavy oak desk. The screen briefly illuminated the dark wood, flashing an alert for yet another new social media story uploaded from Brandt's luxury resort. I did not bother flipping the device over to look at the picture. I simply stared at the dark plastic casing, the heavy silence of the old lodge wrapping securely around me. My voice was incredibly steady, perfectly calm, and completely devoid of any remaining trace of sisterly affection. "Keep spending," I said quietly to the empty room. "You are just buying more evidence for me." The international call arrived right in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at the heavy oak desk in the back office, calmly cross-referencing my corporate compliance reports on my secondary monitor when my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the wood, the screen illuminated with a glaringly long, unrecognized country code. I let it ring 3 times. I wanted the anticipation to stretch, forcing whoever was on the other end to sit in the uncomfortable static-filled silence of an overseas connection. On the 4th ring, I swiped the screen and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. "What the hell did you do with his money?" The voice belonged to Brandt, but the victorious mocking bravado from his beachside text message had completely evaporated. His tone was fractured. It was a chaotic, high-pitched mixture of absolute rage and undeniable creeping terror. The line crackled faintly, carrying the distant, mocking sound of ocean waves crashing against a shoreline thousands of miles away. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, my posture perfectly relaxed. I did not speak to him like a younger sister wounded by her brother's cruelty. I spoke to him using the exact same clinical deadpan cadence I use when interrogating corporate embezzlers in windowless conference rooms. "I secured the estate," I replied smoothly. "I transferred the primary operating funds into a legally protected ledger under my sole executive authority. Every single unauthorized digital request you attempted to process is currently isolated and sitting in a locked audit file. You had absolutely no right to touch those accounts." Bragg spat, his breathing heavy and erratic, into the microphone. "That is family money. You are locking me out of my own inheritance." "I have every right," I countered, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "You, however, have a rapidly expanding legal problem." Before he could launch into another screaming tirade, I heard the sharp rustle of the phone changing hands. A second later, Orber's voice floated over the line. She had completely abandoned Brandt's aggressive frontal assault, instantly pivoting to her signature, weaponized sweetness. "We are all just grieving right now," Orber murmured softly, though I could hear the desperate, unnatural tightness straining her vocal cords. "Emotions are running incredibly high. Let us please not make this an ugly legal mess. There is simply a massive misunderstanding here. We were just authorizing a tiny advance on our portion of the estate to help stabilize our finances back home during this incredibly difficult transition." I let a heavy punishing silence hang on the line for exactly 5 seconds before I dismantled her narrative. "An advance," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a guilty verdict. "Are you referring to the wire transfer you initiated from a hidden Internet Protocol address in Charlotte, attempting to route the estate funds into a fake travel agency owned by your old college roommate? Or perhaps you mean the other advance, the forged real estate auction you filed with Sunbar Capital Recovery, complete with a completely fabricated notary stamp from a strip mall shipping center?" The line went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the satellite connection. The security camera footage from that specific shipping center is remarkably high resolution. I continued relentlessly, driving the nails into the coffin one by one. "And for the record, wearing a stolen gold sign ringing your public vacation photographs while actively committing wire fraud is incredibly poor operational security." I heard a sharp intake of breath. The phone fumbled again and Brandt was back, his voice now a low, cornered snarl. He was completely out of sophisticated maneuvers, so he resorted to brute force threats. "I will sue you into the ground," Brandt yelled, the panic finally breaking through his anger. "I will drag you into a courtroom for embezzling my inheritance. I will have the judge strip you of your executive status before the month is over. You cannot steal my 50%. I actually smiled at the dark, empty office. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his assumption was the exact weakness Grandpart sealers had anticipated. "You cannot steal what has not been distributed," I said calmly, "and you cannot sue over a document You have never actually read. You have absolutely no idea what the will actually dictates, Brant, because the official reading has not even been scheduled yet," he stammered, the threat dying in his throat as the reality of his profound ignorance finally hit him. He had launched a massive illegal offensive based entirely on an assumption. But the true beauty of the trap was not just legal, it was intensely, suffocatingly immediate. I knew exactly why his panic was so raw, so unhinged today. They had flown first class. They had booked a private sprawling luxury villa overlooking the ocean. They had done all of this utilizing Order's remaining high-yield credit cards, banking entirely on the assumption that the stolen wire transfer would clear by Tuesday morning, wiping their debts clean while they drank cocktails on the beach. But the wire had hit the decoy account limit and violently bounced back. "Your cards are declining." "Are they not?" I asked, my tone utterly devoid of sympathy. "The resort concierge is likely standing at the front desk right now, politely demanding a valid form of payment for the remainder of your stay. Your shell company friend cannot front the cash. You tried to fund a victory lap with money that never arrived. If you do not find a way to pay that villa invoice, you are going to be permanently stranded in your own arrogant paradise." "You're a monster," Brant whispered, the fight completely draining out of him, leaving only the hollow echo of a ruined man. I ended the call without another word. I placed the phone flat on the desk and watched the screen. The psychological pressure of being trapped in a foreign country with zero liquidity and a mountain of mounting legal evidence is a terrifying solvent. It eats through discipline and logic. I knew Order would crack first. She was far too calculated to go down with a sinking ship without trying to throw someone else overboard. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone screen illuminated with a rapid-fire sequence of incoming text messages. They were from Order. It was a frantic, chaotic stream of consciousness, desperately attempting to shift the entire burden of guilt onto my brother. She claimed she was intimidated. She claimed Brant had forced her into the shipping center. She claimed she never wanted any part of the fraudulent notary process. Then, right before my eyes, the messages began to disappear one by one as she panicked and frantically recalled them from the chat application. But my fingers were already resting over the physical buttons of my device. I captured a flawless digital screenshot of the screen before she could delete the final most damning message in the sequence. The text frozen forever in my photo gallery read, "We just needed to sign quickly before the county file showed up." I stared at the captured image, a cold sense of absolute victory settling into my bones. This was the exact moment the entire landscape of the war shifted permanently. Brant was not just a greedy man looking for an unearned payday. He was a deeply foolish man who had essentially recorded his own confession. He had walked right into the flames because he genuinely fundamentally believed that I would always be too terrified of breaking the fragile illusion of our family to ever hold him accountable. He thought blood was a shield. He was about to learn that in my hands it was a weapon. The adrenaline from the international phone call slowly bled out of my system, leaving behind a profound heavy stillness that seemed to settle into the very foundation of the old building. The lodge was completely silent, save for the rhythmic, distant lapping of the marsh water against the wooden pilings of the dock outside. I sat alone in the dimming light of the back office. The captured screenshot of Order's deleted confessions safely secured on my encrypted hard drive. I had successfully severed their financial lifeline and trapped them in their own web of deceit. But the war was not over. It was merely shifting from a digital battlefield to a physical one. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked over to the woven rug covering the corner of the floor. I rolled the heavy fabric back, exposing the reinforced steel door of the floor-safe Grandpa sealers had installed over 3 decades ago. The combination was a sequence of numbers only the two of us shared. 4 turns to the right, 3 to the left, 2 to the right. The heavy internal locking mechanism clicked with a satisfying metallic thud. I reached down into the cold, dark cavity and pulled out the single manila envelope resting at the bottom. I had seen it days ago, right after the funeral, but I had left it untouched, waiting for the precise moment the trap required it. Across the front of the heavy paper, written in my grandfather's sharp, unforgiving cursive, was the mandate that had started this entire sequence of events. If Brant is in too much of a hurry, you will know what to do. He had known. He had seen the exact shape of the coming storm long before the clouds ever gathered. I ran my thumb over the brittle wax seal securing the flap of the envelope, then broke it. I tipped the contents onto the scarred wooden surface of the desk. 2 items slid out. The first was a single sheet of heavy cotton paper, neatly folded. The second was a small silver digital storage drive. I unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was slightly shakier than the bold script on the envelope, a testament to his failing physical strength during his final months. But the words themselves carried the weight of an anvil. It was not a sentimental farewell. It was a tactical debriefing from a commander passing the torch to his sole trusted lieutenant. He wrote with absolute crushing clarity. He explicitly detailed how over the past 5 years he had secretly intercepted and paid off tens of thousands of dollars in Brant's delinquent business loans and aggressive credit card debts, completely shielding the rest of the family from the true extent of my brother's catastrophic financial failures. He wrote about standing quietly in the hallway and watching Audrey use her tablet to run unauthorized searches on the county property tax database, actively hunting for the exact acreage and assessed value of the land sitting beneath the lodge. The most devastating paragraph was near the bottom of the page. Grandpa Sealers wrote that a man can only extend his hand so many times before he has to accept that the dog will always bite it. He stated plainly that he held absolutely no remaining illusions that the passage of time or the grace of unconditional forgiveness would ever miraculously transform their innate greed into genuine familial loyalty. He knew they viewed him entirely as an obstacle to their unearned wealth. Attached to the bottom of the letter was a rigid, uncompromising instruction. I was strictly forbidden to access the digital drive unless an heir actively attempted to create a lien, borrow against, sell, or legally encumber the physical property before the standard probate process was entirely finalized. Brand had triggered the exact catastrophic condition. I picked up the silver drive and plugged it into the side port of my laptop. A single video file populated on the screen. I clicked play, the audio routing through the quiet office. The footage showed the interior of Lair Boone's downtown law firm. The harsh fluorescent lighting illuminated Grand Parcellis sitting upright in a high-backed leather chair. Despite the visible physical toll of his illness, his dark eyes were intensely sharp and his posture was completely rigid. Lair sat beside him acting as the formal legal witness. Looking directly into the camera lens, Grand Parcellis clearly stated his full legal name, the current date, and unequivocally declared that he was of entirely sound mind and body. He spoke without a single tremor in his voice. He methodically outlined the exact parameters of the secret contingency plan. He legally cemented the reality that if anyone in our bloodline attempted to financially weaponize his death before the estate was settled, they would instantly trigger a poison pill clause that would strip them of their beneficiary status entirely. Then he leaned slightly forward, speaking directly to me through the screen. He explained that I was the only person he trusted with this immense power, because I was the only person capable of separating my emotions from the necessary brutal reality of survival. He knew I would not let the estate be carved up by cowards. I hit the pause button, freezing his image on the screen. The video was an absolute masterpiece of preemptive legal defense. It was an impenetrable shield that would hold up in any court in the country. But as I stared at his face, I realized something far more important. This video was not just a shield. It was the final fatal thrust of the blade. It was the ultimate weapon. And you never play your most devastating card in the middle of a chaotic skirmish. You hold it back. You let the enemy exhaust their ammunition. You let them back themselves into an inescapable corner, and then you unleash it to end the war permanently. I ejected the drive, slipped it into my pocket, and immediately transitioned into the final phase of the operation. I needed them back on American soil. I needed them sitting in a room where they could not simply disconnect a call or hide behind a delayed international text message. I opened my email client and drafted a highly formal, meticulously worded message to Brant and Orbra. I did not mention the forged documents, the wire fraud, or the fact that they were currently stranded without functional credit cards. Instead, I adopted the completely neutral, accommodating tone of an estate executive seeking a peaceful resolution. I formally requested a mandatory family asset reconciliation meeting to take place at the lodge in exactly 48 hours. I explicitly stated that if they wished to formally discuss the preliminary disbursement of their perceived portion of the estate, their physical presence was legally required. It was an irresistible bait. They were completely out of money, terrified of the digital evidence I possessed, and desperate to reclaim the upper hand. The promise of a negotiation table was the only lifeline they had left. I knew they would find a way to scrape together the funds for 2 economy tickets home, even if they had to beg their wealthy socialite friends for an emergency wire transfer. But I was not just inviting my brother and his wife to this execution. I had a wild card to play. I picked up my phone and dialed the corporate compliance department of Sunbar Capital Recovery. It took several aggressive minutes of navigating their automated system to reach a senior risk management officer. When I finally got a human being on the line, I did not act like a victim. I acted like a senior investigator holding a lip match over a powder keg. I clearly informed the officer that their firm was currently holding a highly illegal forged memorandum of auction against my commercial property. I detailed the fake notary stamp and the security footage. I politely reminded him that attempting to enforce a fraudulent real estate document violated several federal lending statutes. I then offered him a simple, highly beneficial alternative to massive public litigation. I invited their regional legal representative to attend our private family meeting. I knew that any predatory lending institution, when confronted with absolute proof that they had purchased toxic forged paper, would instantly turn on the fraudulent borrower to save their own corporate licensing. Sunbar would not fight me. They would happily help me destroy Brandt. The trap was now fully constructed, armed, and waiting. I closed my laptop, plunging the office into near total darkness. The only illumination came from the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty window panes, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden floor. I leaned back in the heavy chair and replayed the final seconds of the video in my mind. Grandpa Sealers had looked right into the camera, his expression completely devoid of any grandfatherly softness, and delivered his final piece of advice. It echoed in the silent room, a prophetic warning that had perfectly predicted the exact tone Audra had used on the phone earlier that afternoon. Do not soften your heart for someone who only softens their voice when they need the keys. I promised him to the empty room that my heart was already made of stone. They were coming home, bringing their final lies with them, and I was going to let them lock the door behind themselves before I burned the entire house down. They arrived back on American soil exactly 48 hours after my meticulously worded email hit their inboxes. It was a brutal multi-legged journey back from the other side of the globe, and the physical toll was completely undeniable. They did not walk through the front doors of the lodge looking like the glowing victorious socialites they had portrayed in their beachside photographs. Brandt wore a severely wrinkled linen shirt, his posture rigid and defensive, his eyes heavily bloodshot from lack of sleep and the sheer grinding panic of flying economy on borrowed funds. Audra looked physically deflated. Her floorless camera-ready presentation had been abandoned somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, her hair tied back in a messy knot, her designer sunglasses failing to hide the dark, exhausted circles beneath her eyes. They looked exactly like what they were, 2 desperate fugitives whose getaway vehicle had violently blown a tire right outside the city limits. But Brandt was a cornered predator, which made him exceptionally dangerous. He knew he was walking into a hostile environment, so he launched a preemptive strike before he even parked his rental car on the gravel driveway. When I walked into the main living room of the lodge, the air was suffocatingly hot and thick with tension. Brandt and Audra were not waiting alone. Sitting stiffly on the faded floral sofas were 2 of our first cousins, Leo and Marcus. Brandt had spent his agonizing layovers frantically calling our extended family, painting a brilliant, entirely fabricated masterpiece of victimhood. He had completely twisted the narrative, claiming I had suffered a grief-induced mental break after the funeral. He told them I had aggressively locked him out of his rightful inheritance, seized our grandfather's operational accounts to enrich myself, and maliciously stranded him and his grieving wife in a foreign country without a single dollar to their names. The room instantly felt like a makeshift tribunal. Brant immediately took the floor, pacing across the worn rug, playing the role of the deeply wounded, fiercely protective older brother. He raised his voice just enough to sound authoritative, but broken, detailing my supposed cruelty, leaning heavily on the idea that I was aggressively destroying Grandpa Sealer's dying wish for family unity. Right on cue, Order produced a tissue. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes, letting out a soft, highly theatrical sob designed to completely cement the cousin's sympathy. I did not raise my voice to match his manufactured outrage. I did not defend my moral character or beg my cousins to believe my side of the story. Emotion is a completely useless currency in a room built entirely on financial lies. I simply unclasped my leather briefcase and began placing documents onto the heavy oak coffee table. I laid down the banking timestamp of the unauthorized wire transfer attempt. Right beside it, I placed the printed county log showing the exact minute the forged real estate memorandum was electronically filed. Then I set down a printed timeline, calmly cross-referencing those exact fraudulent timestamps with the digital check-in records of their luxury resort. I spoke in a flat clinical monotone, translating the paper trail for Leo and Marcus. I did not call Brant a thief. I simply showed them the undeniable math of a robbery, perfectly synchronized with a funeral procession. Brant vehemently denied it all. He slammed his hand against the door frame, pointing at the papers and calling them fabricated corporate garbage I had mocked up to steal his half of the estate. He turned to Leo aggressively demanding backup, leveraging their childhood bond, and demanding Leo put me in my place for tearing the bloodline apart over technicalities. But the room did not pivot the way Brant expected. Leo, a quiet man who ran a local hardware store and actively avoided family drama, stared hard at the forged county document on the table. He slowly shook his head, looking up at Brant with a mixture of profound disappointment and cult realization. Leo cleared his throat and stated very clearly that Grandpa Sealers had asked him to come by the lodge 2 months prior. Sealers had explicitly asked Leo to act as a verbal witness to a very specific ironclad boundary. Sealers had told Leo that under absolutely no circumstances was Brant ever allowed to handle, review, or authorize any paperwork related to the physical land of the estate, because Sealers knew Brant was actively pricing the dirt beneath their feet while pretending to ask about his health. The revelation hung in the room like a physical blow. The illusion of the gold-entrusted grandson completely shattered into 1,000 pieces. That was the exact moment Orber's carefully constructed mask violently ripped apart. She realized the rural cousins she had always quietly despised were not blindly falling for the performance. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. Her voice lost all of its practiced breathy sweetness. It turned incredibly sharp, dripping with venomous, unhinged condescension. She looked at Leo, then at Marcus, and finally glared directly at me, spitting out that we were all just bitter, backwater country fools. She screamed that she and Brant had wasted years pretending to care about this rotting, mosquito-infested swamp and our pathetic, small-town lives. She declared they solely endured our suffocating, uncultured company because they legally deserved the financial payout. She openly admitted, screaming in front of the very bloodline she had spent years manipulating, that Grandpa Sealers was never a grandfather to her. He was just a stubbornly locked door standing between her and a massive overdue payday. The silence that followed her outburst was absolute. Leo and Marcus looked at her in horrified disgust, but Brant, completely blinded by his own toxic arrogance and desperate greed, still refused to retreat. He grabbed Order's arm, forcefully pulling her back to the sofa, but his eyes were locked entirely on me. He genuinely believed he still held the ultimate leverage. He sneered, his chest heaving, stating that none of my printed timelines or Order's emotional outbursts changed the fundamental law of inheritance. He told me that if I truly wanted to drag our family name through a grueling public criminal investigation, I would permanently destroy the estate's reputation and completely bankrupt the lodge in legal fees. He was banking heavily on the deeply ingrained, Southern tradition of keeping ugly family secrets quietly buried at all costs. He thought I was simply trying to scare him into a more favorable private financial settlement. He was entirely convinced I lacked the actual nerve to pull the pin on the grenade and destroy the facade of the family in front of the entire county. He crossed his arms, leaning back, demanding I name my price to make the paperwork go away. He was waiting for me to negotiate. He was waiting for a compromised surrender. I did not give him a single inch. I looked at him, completely absorbing the full spectrum of his delusion. And then I checked my watch. I informed the room that this was absolutely not a negotiation, and I was not the one deciding his fate. I calmly announced that our estate attorney, Layer Boone, had formerly scheduled a mandatory supplementary reading of the estate files for 9:00 the following morning at her downtown office. I watched the blood completely drain from Brandt's face as I explicitly clarified that this was not a standard probate reading. I told him Layer would be formally unsealing a highly classified, heavily witnessed contingency document that grandpa sealers had secretly executed right before his death. It was a document completely unknown to anyone on earth except Silas, the attorney, and me, and it was going to dictate exactly what happened to a thief who could not wait for the grave to be filled. The atmosphere inside the downtown conference room of Layer Boone's law firm at exactly 9:00 the next morning was not merely tense. It was clinically lethal. When Brandt and Order walked through the heavy glass doors, they were bracing themselves for a screaming match with a grieving sister. They expected tears, emotional manipulation, and perhaps a bitter negotiation over percentages. Instead, they walked straight into a fully assembled legal firing squad. I was already seated at the head of the massive mahogany table. To my right, Sartor, her posture rigid, a thick stack of finalized legal binders resting under her hands. But it was the other side of the table that caused the remaining color to completely drain from my brother's face. Nora Cade, the veteran title officer from the county, sat with her arms crossed, staring at him with absolute, unconcealed disgust. Next to her was a man Brandt had never met, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit representing the predatory private finance firm Sunbar Capital Recovery. Beside him sat a sworn financial investigator from the county clerk's fraud division, his badge visibly clipped to his belt. Tucked away in the corner chairs were the two elderly witnesses who had signed Grandpa Sealers' final secret contingency documents. Brandt froze in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass handle. Audra stumbled a half step behind him, her eyes darting frantically around the room as her brain desperately tried to calculate the sheer magnitude of the ambush. They were ordered to sit. They collapsed into the leather chairs like they were made of lead. Layer did not offer a polite morning greeting or a preamble about family healing. She simply reached over, plugged the silver digital drive into her laptop, and mirrored the screen to the massive monitor mounted on the far wall. The room plunged into silence as Grandpa Sealers appeared on the screen. His voice, sharp and lucid, echoed off the glass walls. He looked directly into the camera and stated his absolute, undeniable condition. He declared that if Brandt or anyone operating on his behalf attempted to leverage, sell, mortgage, or legally encumber Marsh Lantern Lodge before the probate process was formally completed, they would instantly trigger a poison pill clause, irrevocably stripping them of their entire inheritance. Brandt sat paralyzed, his jaw tight, but I could see the defiant glint still lingering in his eyes. He still fundamentally believed he was fighting for half of a multi-million-dollar coastal empire. He thought the punishment was a bluff. Then Layer paused the video and delivered the first crushing legal blow. She opened the heavy black binder and read the actual terms of the unsealed will. Brand had never possessed half of the estate. Grandpa Sealers, entirely aware of his grandson's catastrophic financial incompetence, had only left him a single flat sum of $25,000. It was meant to be a final modest lifeline to start over, heavily conditional on Brandt executing zero fraudulent actions during the estate transition. The realization hit Brandt like a physical shock wave. He had risked federal wire fraud, international embarrassment, and multiple felonies over an absolute delusion. He had tried to steal a kingdom that was never his to begin with, destroying his life for $25,000. But Leah was not finished. She delivered the second strike without missing a beat. Because the fraudulent real estate auction had officially been filed with the county, the contingency clause was permanently activated. That $25,000 was instantly forfeited. Leah stated plainly that the funds were already being legally redirected into a designated recovery trust to ensure the long-term mechanics and cleaning staff of the lodge received their pensions, and to cover the extensive legal fees required to scrape Brandt's forged paperwork off the county land records. He was getting absolutely nothing. Zero. Then came the third twist, the one that completely broke their united front. The representative from Sunbar Capital Recovery leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He did not look at Brandt. He locked eyes entirely with Orber. He informed the room that Sunbar did not take kindly to being utilized as a pawn in a family forgery scheme. Their internal security division had completely bypassed the fake notary stamp and traced the digital footprint of the filing directly back to the travel agency owned by Orber's former college roommate. He explicitly stated that Sunbar was preparing to cooperate fully with the state prosecutor. If this dispute moved forward, Orber would not just be facing a civil lawsuit for financial damages. She would be facing direct criminal prosecution for conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Orber let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands violently trembling as she covered her mouth. The flawless, untouchable socialite was suddenly staring down the barrel of a state prison sentence. Brandt completely snapped. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table, jumping to his feet, screaming that I had maliciously orchestrated this entire scenario. He pointed a shaking finger at me, yelling that I had deliberately left the bank accounts open to trap him, that I had set a psychological snare to ruin his life. Before I could even have opened my mouth to respond, the county investigator calmly reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a single printed sheet of paper and slid it across the smooth table until it rested directly in front of my brother. It was a high-resolution print out of the text message Brandt had sent from his luxury villa in Bali, the one Orber had frantically tried to delete. "Do it fast before the girl reads the will." The words sat there in stark, undeniable black and white. It was the absolute definition of premeditated malice. There was no defense. There was no charm left to deploy. The room fell into a suffocating terminal silence. Brandt slowly sank back into his chair, the arrogant fire in his chest completely extinguished, leaving behind only the pathetic, hollow shell of a man who had finally run out of lies. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the table. I did not offer a soft negotiation or a sisterly compromise. I offered an executioner's absolute final choice. I pushed two thick, stapled legal documents across the table toward them. It was a comprehensive, ironclad relinquishment of all rights. It dictated that they formally admit they held zero legal or financial claim to Marsh Langham Lodge, the surrounding land, or any liquid assets of the estate. It required their full sworn cooperation in actively dissolving the fraudulent Sunbar lien. And finally, I demanded the immediate return of Grandpa Sealers's gold signet ring. "Sign the papers, give me back his ring, and disappear from my property forever," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it commanded the entire room. "If you refuse, or if you even attempt to negotiate a single syllable on those pages, I will stand up, walk out of this room, and hand every single shred of digital and physical evidence over to the district attorney for immediate criminal indictment. You will both go to prison, and I will still keep the lodge." Brandt stared at the paper for a long, agonizing minute. For the absolute first time in his entirely privileged life, he realized that his handsome smile, his smooth apologies, and his shared bloodline could not save him from the cold, hard reality of black ink on white paper. He reached up slowly, sliding the heavy gold signet ring off his right index finger. He placed it quietly on the table. It made a dull, heavy thud against the wood. He picked up the black pen and signed his name. Orber signed immediately after him. She could barely hold the pen, her signature a jagged, frantic scrawl. She did not look up at me. She was utterly terrified, finally realizing that the quiet, dutiful sister-in-law she had spent years mocking and dismissing was entirely capable of destroying her life without ever raising her voice. Once the ink was dry, They stood up and walked out of the conference room. They did not say goodbye. They simply vanished into the crowded downtown streets, carrying nothing but their debt and their absolute defeat. In the months that followed, the dust finally settled. I did not execute a massive vengeful fire sale of Marsh Lantern Lodge. I followed the exact blueprint Grandpa Sealers and I had designed. I formally signed the highly lucrative 99-year ground lease with Blue Meridian Freight for the 17 acres of undeveloped swamp behind the property. The massive corporate logistics hub was built far enough back that it remained entirely invisible from the water. With the massive influx of guaranteed corporate capital, I kept the original lodge, the rotting wooden dock, and the chaotic outdoor repair shop. I hired Matt to run the marina full-time. I poured the money back into the wood and the soil, meticulously restoring the property into a thriving, respectable coastal business, proudly bearing our grandparents' name. On a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year after the funeral, I walked out onto the wooden porch of the lodge. The air was thick and humid, filled with the rhythmic hum of seekers and the salty scent of the marsh wind. Above my head, the newly repaired vintage neon sign sparked, buzzing with strong, steady electricity, casting a warm teal glow over the dark water. I sat down in Grandpa Sealers' old wooden rocking chair, completely alone, and looked out at the peaceful horizon. I finally understood the profound truth of his final lesson. The most beautiful, devastating revenge you can ever inflict upon a toxic person is not loudly destroying their life. True revenge is simply closing the heady door they always assumed would be left unlocked for them, and then quietly, peacefully thriving inside the very sanctuary they never deserved to inhabit. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Azad Revenge Stories, like the video, and support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. Thanks.